Get him to 101. Check your couch cushions for spare adrenochrome. True. We need to get on the market while we can. Okay, so, man, how do we open up a topic about a guy like Henry Kissinger, whose death it's in and of itself, and the anticipation around his death became a meme, to the point where when anyone died, there would be memes about, it isn't Henry Kissinger. Because everybody felt like they were almost riding a horrific roller coaster in his life, and we have reached the precipice where he dies. Everybody was just waiting in anticipation. That at least was the environment around it, or that's what the environment felt like on Twitter. I mean, anytime we'd hear any news about Henry Kissinger, it felt like everybody was just waiting. Every time anybody else died, it was, why wasn't it Henry Kissinger? We'll get him next time. And now it's happened. So considering how much people have been waiting for this, considering the massive impact he's had on American statecraft, considering the amount of people whose deaths are directly and indirectly connected to his actions while operating, both as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, which no other person in American foreign policy history was able to hold both titles at the same time, which he did under Nixon for 2 years. He was National Security Advisor and Secretary of State at the same time. That's an immense amount of power for any statesman outside of the President of the United States to have. And that is something that no other foreign policy guru or statesman has been able to achieve since. Dean Acheson is maybe the closest other Secretary of State that had as much influence as Henry Kissinger. And I would go as far to say Henry Kissinger went further. Dick Cheney doesn't come close. Henry Kissinger went further. And so considering the amount of influence he had on the Nixon administration, the Ford administration, and how his words has continued to echo down between administrations, as between every crisis, Henry Kissinger somehow waddles his ass into the White House to advise the president on what to do, which he did with George Bush after 9/11, which he did with Barack Obama, which he did with every major political figure that has led this country forward since he was with the Nixon administration. And before we get into why I don't like Henry Kissinger and why I think Henry Kissinger is kind of really a monster in my view, and I don't mean to say that to dehumanize him, but I think a better way to put it is that I believe his actions while on this earth were monstrous. I do want to at least give some attention as to why there seems to be so much regalia around his death, why there's so much respect for him in the American state, the American State Department, why there's so much respect to him for a lot of American politicians, for a lot of world leaders. He carries a ton of respect in China, for example. He carries a lot of respect amongst the Chinese establishment. And as to why people in the international relations community or around who work around statecraft respect him, because I don't want to just say this guy was a monster and that was that. Because if I do that, which is what everybody else on this platform has done around Henry Kissinger, then what are you guys gonna do when you run into somebody who's like, do you know what he did around detente with the Soviet Union and nuclear arms control and decreasing relations? And then you're gonna sit there and you're gonna be like, I didn't hear about that. And then they're going to have something else. They're going to say, hey, did you hear how he used America's nuclear readiness to deter the Soviet Union from sending weapons to Egypt? Or, hey, did you hear how he used shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East? Or, hey, did you hear how he did this? And I want to give you guys a few ideas as to why he's somewhat respected, because if I don't give you that context, you might find yourself blindsided in the future, and maybe to clear up a little bit of confusion as to why somebody with so much blood on their hands, and indirectly on their hands, I don't know how to say it for the people he didn't directly order, but was involved in creating the conditions to have people murdered, as is the example in Chile. I do want to give you a little bit of an explanation. So I didn't know what article to bring up to give you an idea of why people like Henry Kissinger. So I'm just going to have his image up on screen for a little bit. Here's a foreign affairs piece. It's by Joseph Nye Jr. This is somebody who acknowledged a lot of the failings of Henry Kissinger, but still came to the conclusion that Henry Kissinger was generally a positive for the world, and specifically, of course, the United States. I disagree with his conclusion, but if you don't know much about why people like Henry Kissinger, this might be a good article to start. Plus, it also doesn't just ignore the stuff he did in Cambodia, so that's why I think it's a better article than the others who just kind of brush over all of that or ignore that entirely to just talk about his achievements around the Yom Kippur War and stuff like that. So, first off, Henry Kissinger first came into prominence in around 1956 because he wrote an article about nukes and nuclear arm control and the idea of deterrence and trying to stop other nation states from using nukes against you. And it kind of laid a lot of the groundwork for the conversation around nuclear arms control early in the conversation. This was 1956. Nuclear weapons had only been on the battlefield for about 10 years. And not only had nuclear weapons only been on the battlefield for about 10 years, but it had only been possessed by our political opponents for about 3 years. I think the Soviet Union got their first nuclear test and had alerted the world to their possession of nuclear weapons in 1953. I forget when the Chinese did it, but I think it was within 10 years of that. And so that's when he first got a lot of attention. And then he eventually was able to bring himself into power with the election of Richard Nixon, when Nixon ran against Hubert Humphrey after President Johnson decided not to run for re-election. Now, I do want to put a little tidbit about him rising to power under the Nixon administration, because there's something that happened in the process of that gives my first displeasures around Henry Kissinger, aside from, of course, his ideology, was that was when he was rising to power, he was actually in groups of people. He was connected within the Johnson administration in the negotiation process in Vietnam. And he was able to get information about how the negotiation process was going, and then he leaked it to Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon, and this is how it's reported, Richard Nixon then reportedly, and a lot of this is more information that's come out more recently in the 90s and the early 2000s, tapes and documents that were released of the Johnson administration. He then sent a woman, I believe it was a secretary of sorts, to go to the North Vietnamese ambassador and basically say, hold out. No, the South Vietnamese ambassador, and say, hold out. You'll get a better deal, basically a better deal under Nixon. Now, it's doubted whether this had an impact on the negotiations under Johnson with the North Vietnamese failing. That's doubted. But it is highly suspected that Nixon basically tried to interfere in the foreign policy of the United States, which is highly, highly, highly illegal. And we have tapes proving that President Johnson confronted Nixon over this, which Henry Kissinger, and this is true of much of Nixon's crimes, which is one of my big problems with Henry Kissinger, is he aided and abetted in that crime. He aided and abetted in funneling this information to Nixon, which he should not have done, which Nixon then used to try to interfere with the foreign policy of the United States while not being President of the United States. Anyway, Nixon wins. Henry Kissinger hoists himself up to the position of National Security Advisor, and one of the promises that was made during Nixon's campaign was that they were going to pull out of Vietnam. They decided not to do that. They decided to 180 on that promise. They always had this idea, it's very Trumpian, this might remind you of something, that on the campaign trail they had like a secret plan to get their boys home and kind of like win the war and everything would be good and everything would be wonderful. Very Trumpian when you hear it now in 2023 going into 2024. And apparently that secret plan was manifested in a few ways. It manifested in an illegal invasion of Cambodia. It manifested in an illegal invasion of Laos. And it also manifested in an illegal bombing campaign in Cambodia, which ended up destabilizing the leading government there, which then led to the regime of the Khmer Rouge and then to the deaths of 1.5 million people. That's on top of the deaths of people from the bombing in both Cambodia and Laos, the invasions in both Cambodia and Laos, and the people who are dying today from unexploded ordnances, both of those countries. The war, from their time stepping in office, lasted well into the 1970s to only end in the mid-1970s, after they came into office in the late 1960s. Actually, I think the war ended up extending like a good 3 to 4 years because of, I forget the exact dates, because of this I don't know what to call it besides massive bombing campaign, tearing of the earth, that Kissinger thought would allow them to pull out of the country eventually, with still holding up the South Vietnamese domino. So from there, I could go into many of the other crimes of Henry Kissinger that he was involved in. I think one of the major ones that I would be angry about is also connected to one of his major achievements. Like I said earlier, Henry Kissinger was involved in, shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East, which he is praised for, détente with the Soviet Union, which I think basically nobody in the foreign policy establishment or anybody that I know would say that détente with the Soviet Union was a bad thing, considering, what came afterwards and, not wanting to all die in a nuclear hellfire. You can praise these things, but one thing that is often praised, and to a degree I also agree with it, I think it was good, is normalization with China. It opened up vast economic opportunity for both the Chinese and the United States, and it allowed the United States to take advantage of the Sino-Soviet split, which then we pursued through funding of the Mujahideen and spy bases and all sorts of stuff. But Kissinger, this was Kissinger's baby. He wanted it, and he wanted it bad. But the problem was that after, 30 years of communism is going to destroy America, and even more before that, but after World War II, it really ramped up. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of fear about re-engagement with the Chinese under a Nixon administration, which would make them look weak on communism, considering that much of their political support base had come from anti-communist attitudes. It was part of the reason why the South Vietnamese held out, was because they were going to get a Nixon in office, and the Nixon hates the communists. So to avoid a lot of this political backlash that would ultimately come with them meeting with the totalitarian communist regime, was that Kissinger decided he would meet with them in secret. He'd tell the press that, hey, don't worry about it. I'm going to be sick in the Himalaya or in the mountains or whatever. That's what he'll tell the press. But what he'll really be doing is going through Pakistan to go into China. And he was going to use Pakistan as a middleman to go from there to China to then start negotiation to open up ties and relations, which would ultimately be successful. But what people don't talk about is that part of the reason that that we had a good enough relationship with the Pakistani government, and this is something that Henry Kissinger said himself, part of the reason why he was able to achieve what he did in China was because he stood with the Pakistani military after enduring the genocide against the Bengali people. When Pakistan invaded Bangladesh and murdered over 300,000 people on the low estimate, genocide, it's the Bangladesh genocide, the genocide against the Bangladeshi people. When that occurred, we had American diplomats sending diplomatic cables to the White House to Henry Kissinger, and he basically blew them all off. And there was a really snide comment he made at the time around, those who bleed for the Bengalis, because he wanted to have a productive relationship with the Pakistani dictatorship, with the Pakistani military junta. And there's also reason to believe, and Kissinger has admitted to this somewhat, that part of it was that both him and President Nixon did not like the Indian Prime Minister, who Kissinger referred to as a bitch, which is a true story. There's audio of it, and it's been leaked. So in order to achieve what we did in China, it did take, according to Henry Kissinger, some blood in Bangladesh. And so this is it's also while this is a very different topic, obviously a very different conflict, it kind of reminds me of when people talk to me about the Abraham Accords, and I remember what happened in order for us to get the Moroccan government to recognize the Israeli government was that we had to recognize the Moroccan government's sovereignty over Western Sahara, which has been striving for independence for decades. And the UN said, and this is a UN vote that we agreed to, that we voted in favor of in the 90s, that they deserve an independence vote. And it was never held. But we compromised on that in order to bring back relations between the Israelis and the Moroccan, or they birthed that diplomatic relationship. There's a certain compromising on humanitarian global standards going on, which I am not a fan of. And this is one of my main critiques, and always is going to be one of my main critiques of Henry Kissinger, is while he has spent, I think, parts of the end of his life, like writing books like World Order, trying to advocate for, an international, somewhat norms-based system, or like a system based on state sovereignty and certain rules of laws based off the Westphalian system. He has spent much of his time in office violating state sovereignty, whether it be with the coup in Chile, abating and abiding, either helping or assisting in or ignoring atrocities around the world, whether it be in Latin America, whether it be in Bangladesh, whether it be in Sri Lanka. I believe it's Sri Lanka. I'm sorry, not Sri Lanka, East Timor. Sri Lanka, East Timor, when the Indonesian government told President Ford and Nixon and Kissinger that they were going to invade East Timor, and they basically said, just do it quickly, which he lied about shortly after, said, oh, we only found out when we were getting on the plane. That was a lie. He was informed beforehand, and he just said to them, get it done quickly. What then took place was the death of 100,000 to 180,000 people. And it was done mostly with American guns, American bombs, and American munitions that we had provided to the Indonesians. And so on one hand, he talks about sovereignty and the sovereignty of states needing to be respected in a lot of these newer books that he's written that has been able to get him hugged by liberals, right? And statements that he makes, which a lot of it makes, when you read the words that he publishes, he's a very intelligent man. He's very good at communicating. He's very good at getting his ideas across. He is a giant of a scholar, but he doesn't abide by his own principles. At least the principles of the more modern books he writes about when it comes to world order. And putting that aside, with the more modern works that he doesn't abide by, and why I don't like the hypocrisy of the international system that we've built, if we're able to violate the rules of it and get away with it scot-free, it's part of the reason why I believe we need to join the International Criminal Court. So, I don't like the crimes that he's committed, whether it be the coup in Chile. I don't like it. The crimes that he's ignored in order to get diplomatic accomplishments, and basically just look the other way, like what happened in Pakistan or what happened in East Timor. And I also don't like the thinking that he's put forward outside of like the newer, more kind of libtardy stuff that he's said, and I hate to call it that way. But I also don't like the general principles of realpolitik that has been taken from Kissinger, the strain of thought that many have adapted. I don't know if you guys were seeing a certain tweet that was going viral about Geert Wilders. It was an old tweet from 2018 where he went into Moscow and went into the Duma and took a bunch of pictures and was trying to talk about engagement with the Russians 4 years after the Russians invaded Crimea. And he said a few things, but one of the words that interested me was that he said, like, bring back realpolitik. Bring back realpolitik. And for those of you who don't know what realpolitik is, and I hate to get into all of the specifics of realpolitik and how Henry Kissinger used realpolitik or his strain of realist thought, so I'll just try to be blunt. What realpolitik is that states on the international level should generally pursue their own interests. They should pursue their own interests, and any system of morality or any system of justice and trying to have that abide your actions on the international stage is silly. because there is no justice, there is no morality in the chaos of the international system. And because there is no justice and morality, you do not apply your domestic political ethics on the international stage. And while a lot of his more early work, more later works talk about the international system and stuff like that, it is this strain of thought which Kissinger is most known for. It is this strain of thought which has gotten the most attention around Kissinger. And so I didn't really know what to talk about around Henry Kissinger when preparing for the segment. If we were going to talk about all of his works and we were going to read his articles, if we were going to talk about like his crimes and why his crimes were awful, or if we were going to like talk about the ideology behind it. So I wanted to do a little bit of all three, which I don't particularly like, because it feels like if you do a little bit of all three, you don't do one particularly well. But I didn't think anybody else was gonna give you that combination, and it was mostly just going to be just listing the crimes. And so I wanted to give you some general background to the crimes, how they came about, as well as the general ethics around him, or the general philosophy around him that has had the longest impact. I wonder if there's anything else I should touch on for Henry Kissinger. Is there anything else I should touch on for Henry Kissinger? I didn't just do the segment in 15, 20 minutes. I must have forgot. You know, sometimes I say everything I want to say in a very quick way. And then I'm kind of surprised and I feel like I should be saying more. So I don't know what else to say, because I talked about East Timor. I talked about Bangladesh. I talked about, I talked about basically everything. I talked about Vietnam. Oh, he won the Nobel Peace Prize? The thing is about the Nobel Peace Prize, he didn't even really, he was like, he took the money, then he gave the money to charity, and then he said he'd be willing to give it back. And the person he won it with, the North Vietnamese negotiator, didn't accept the prize because they said the United States wasn't abiding by it. So, you know, when we say he won the Nobel Peace Prize, it seems like he was generally ambivalent to it, you know? Like, it was weird. It was like trying to, like get a bird to appreciate like a modern art masterpiece. I don't know how to compare it, but it was like, the elegance of it was lost on him, I guess. Farno, thank you so much for the Prime. I appreciate it. The elegance of it was lost on Henry. So the reasons why Henry Kissinger are generally respected is because of his the fact that he's been involved in American statecraft for so long and therefore has had much influence. I think a lot of it, honestly, is because when he talks to more liberal people behind closed doors, he's more dovish. When he talks to more conservative, more hawkish people behind closed doors, he's more hawkish and, conservative leaning. A lot of people would say that he played Nixon like a fiddle. And he would lean into Nixon's sometimes described as erratic emotions to take advantage of it. So I think that's part of the reason why he's so liked, is because he's really good at playing into people's emotions, playing into, what people receive positively and picking up on what people receive negatively. I think part of it is because he has had some real foreign policy achievements, whether it be shuttle diplomacy, whether it be detente. It's just many of these achievements are drenched in blood themselves. For example, normalization with China. For example, positive relationships with Indonesia, considering what they did in East Timor. For example, a relationship with many South American countries. Many of these achievements would be either drenched in blood, or he's done so many other horrific things that in many ways violates the international order that he says that he wants to see upheld, that I just don't believe that any of the good he's done could ever even begin to outweigh the bad that he's done. And many of the good that he has done, I also don't believe he was always 100% necessary in order to achieve that. Like, I do think that there would probably be alternative ways to approach détente, but I don't know. I really don't know if a different administration with a different Secretary of State or National Security Advisor, somebody who held as much influence as Henry Kissinger did, if our government would have approached the invasion of East Timor with American weapons differently had Kissinger not been in that seat, or if we didn't have Gerald Ford in that position with Kissinger advising him. I don't know, because he had so much influence. One, without a situation like that without Kissinger is almost impossible to imagine. But if we could have had that scenario, I do think we would have had a generally better world. I think the 100 to 180,000 dead in East Timor and being able to avoid that would have been a better world. I think an earlier withdrawal from Vietnam without an illegal invasion of Cambodia, an illegal invasion of Laos, and the unexploded munitions that are still detonating there to this day, I do think that would probably be a better world. And I just can't get around the violations of the international rules-based order that he points to as wanting to see built. I mean, he wrote a whole book on it, World Order. Okay, I don't know what else to say about Henry Kissinger. Man, I thought I would be talking about this longer. I thought I'd have more contention in the chat or something. But no, okay, you guys all sat down. You took your short Kissinger lesson quite well, I think. But man, this guy was a workhorse. I do want to emphasize that. This guy was a workhorse. He was influencing politics up until the day he died. A few months ago, I think it was like 4 or 5 months ago, he was meeting with Xi Jinping before Biden did recently. I mean, he carried immense influence all the way till the end. All the way to the end, he carried immense influence.
RS385 has donated $5. My Indonesian friends are glad he passed and feel bad that their country had those acts and blood on their hands. Also, it's crazy how much he was a ladies' man to the point
he got a Bond girl. Oh yeah, that's the one thing. This is the one thing I got to give him credit for, is that he was a real ladies' man and he liked big women. There was a video of Mao being like baffled by the size of Mao Kissinger wife, the size of Kissinger's wife, one of his wives. Where is it? Is this it? Yes, this is it. Look, there's Mao meeting Kissinger. He's like, oh yeah. And then come over here comes his wife. Where is it? A moment. Here. See? I love this video. he's baffled by the height difference. But you know, Kissinger was a massive ladies' man. Massive ladies' man. And he was pretty well known for going out there and lying around. Oh, here's another thing that Kissinger did that doesn't get enough attention. It's another thing he didn't do. When negotiating détente with the Soviet Union, this is another example of what I was saying, like a lot of his achievements being built upon either ignoring mass suffering or sometimes enabling mass suffering. That was done under the understanding that America would not push the issue of Jews being able to immigrate from the Soviet Union to places like Israel, or places where they would have more political freedoms and religious freedoms. And Henry Kissinger got a lot of heat because a statement that he said around the time was, and this was released later or leaked to the press, the immigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy. And if they put Jews into gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern, maybe a humanitarian concern. Now, of course, Kissinger says that this is out of context. I don't really say what context it could be in that would make it good. Also, Kissinger's Jewish, which just makes it that much more confusing.